Now, someone who's had a lot of experience flying commercial planes is Captain Chelsey Sully Sullenberger. He's become a household name in America after he successfully made an emergency landing on the Hudson River in New York in 2009. He saved the lives of all 155 people on board his U.S. Airways flight. Captain Sullenberger joins us here in the studio. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Anand. Good to be with you.
That was a day that not many of us will forget. You were commanding that flight, U.S. Airways Flight 1549, took off from LaGuardia, heading for the West Coast. You were in the air. What happened then?
In the air just 100 seconds after takeoff, and after almost 30 years of routine flying where we try hard never to be surprised by anything, we were suddenly confronted with an ultimate challenge of a lifetime that we'd never specifically trained for. I saw the flock of Canada geese about 2 seconds before we struck them. They disabled both engines. We were forced to land on the Hudson River, the only landing area available to us. We landed 208 seconds after we lost thrust in the engines. We had a remarkably good outcome.
So you had no power at that point. Did you glide the plane into the river?
We did. That airplane became a large, very efficient glider. It was just a matter of time before our flight path intersected the Earth. My choice was where that should happen. And the only place available to us that was long enough, wide enough, smooth enough to accommodate attempting to land a large jet airliner was the Hudson River. And I was glad to have it.
I guess you have to have great presence of mind when you're doing that, but was there a point at any time when you saw those geese fly into the engines, you lost your power, where you felt this plane could go down and disintegrate?
I didn't think that we were going to fail that day. I didn't think we were going to die that day, but I realized immediately that this was going to be the most difficult day of my life. And I knew that unlike almost every other flight I'd had at that point for 42 years and 20,000 hours in the air, this flight probably would not end on a runway with the aircraft undamaged. But I was okay with that as long as I could solve the problem of how to deliver it to the surface intact so that we could all survive.
And you had a good idea of what the terrain was like below you, where the rivers were, where there was open land, where there were buildings?
Having flown into New York many times, I knew that there were only 2 runways anywhere near us, but it turned out they were unreachable, and that the only place to land was the river, the only place in that developed area that would accommodate us.
Right. Did you have any fears that there could be obstacles in the river itself?
No, I really wasn't concerned about that. It was an open area. I was intentionally heading south along the river to land between the ferry terminals in New York and New Jersey so that a quick rescue could be possible. And that was essential, especially on such a cold day.
What kind of training do you have for an eventuality like that? You know, both your engines knocked out.
Well, very little, actually. Now pilots are trained in the loss of both engines, but in our flight simulators, it's not possible to practice a water landing. The data don't exist. The simulators are not programmed for it. So believe it or not, the only training that my first officer, Jeff Skylson, ever got for a water landing was a theoretical classroom discussion. So we had one chance to do it right, something we'd never practiced before.
Right, you say you were 100 seconds out when the plane's engines were hit. At what height were you flying?
Just about 3,000 feet, and this was just 4 or 5 miles beyond the runway after takeoff.
Right, would it have been more dangerous if you were higher?
No, being higher would have given us more time to troubleshoot the problem, more time to have a solution, more altitude to glide farther and perhaps try to make a runway.
Because when we look at a plane, we see this huge steel machine. Not many of us think that this thing could glide, that if the engines go, it's going to drop like a stone.
Well, actually, on a normal descent, the thrust levels are near idle. And so you glide toward the airplane from your cruising height almost all the way to the runway. It's only right before landing that the thrust comes up to prepare for a possible go-around.
In your experience and all the flying that you've done, what do you think that you had to bring that plane down safely, save all those passengers that other pilots don't have?
I think it's what many pilots have and what every pilot should have is a well-internalized paradigm of how to set priorities even in unforeseen circumstances, how to solve any problem in an airplane. And I paid attention over thousands of flights, tens of thousands of hours, on precisely managing the height, the speed, the total energy of the jet airplane, knowing if I was higher or lower or faster or slower than desired. And that was the ability, the awareness that was able to give me the ability to look out the window, look at potential landing sites, and say yes or no, I can or cannot glide that far, and be right under those conditions of crisis.
When you realized you had problems, that you had no thrust, you had no power, you had to land the plane, and you informed ground control that you were in serious trouble. What was their response?
A bit of incredulity. A wonderful young man working in the radar scope, Patrick Harton, a second-generation air traffic controller. His father had worked in the same New York radar facility before him. Told me later he had clearly heard when I said I was going to land in the Hudson, and he said, "Say again?" just because he couldn't wrap his mind around the concept. And he assumed that by choosing that path, that we would all perish. It was only later that he learned that the airplane was floating, that people were evacuating successfully, and we, in fact, all survived.
Right, so there came a point where you actually lost control with the tower.
Yes, below a certain altitude, we lost both radar contact and radio contact with the air traffic controller.
Right, now as you say, pilots are now trained for this kind of eventuality, should the engines go out. What other changes has the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, that's the regulatory body here in the United States, what changes have they implemented since that incident?
Actually, very few. Surprisingly, frustratingly, very few. In the U.S., our National Transportation Safety Board is the agency that investigates transportation accidents, and they have findings of probable cause and contributing factors, and they make important safety improvement recommendations going forward, but they can't mandate that those be adopted. It's up to our aviation regulatory authority, in this case, in this country, the FAA, to mandate that the airline make improvements. And surprisingly, out of several dozen recommendations that the NTSB made, I think only a few have been implemented so far. And some of the recommendations are intuitively obvious, such as requiring that all domestic flights have a life vest for every passenger and not simply a seat cushion for flotation.
Were you surprised or even shocked that, you're flying this sophisticated machine? There's so many things in it that are working all at once to make this get into the air, to take people to where they want to get to, that was brought down by birds.
It's a rare occurrence, but it's not the first time it's happened. And it could happen again tomorrow. But airplanes are designed to be able to withstand impacts as much as is possible given the technology, the materials that we have. And pilots are trained to do what we can to avoid them. But the warnings that we get about birds are very general, non-specific, and not particularly useful. So one of the things that many people are looking to improve is how do we alert pilots and air traffic controllers to the presence of birds that may pose a threat, and then get that information in useful form quickly to the cockpit. It's important to remember that it doesn't take large birds to bring down an airplane. A sufficient number of small birds also have done so historically.
I don't think too many people want to know about that. One of the things you had to do when the plane got into trouble was to bring this machine down safely, save the passengers, but that's one part of your job. The other part of your job, of course, is keeping the passengers calm and reassuring them that you are going to get that plane down. What did you say to them when you knew there was trouble?
Well, in the 208 seconds that we had from the time we lost thrust until we had actually landed, I took what was probably an extravagant amount of time, 3 or 4 seconds, to choose my words very carefully before I made that one announcement in the cabin. And I said, "This is the captain, brace for impact." I wanted to identify myself as the decision maker. I wanted to sound confident, not agitated. I used specific words for specific reasons. I used the word brace because at my airline and others, in our structured, well-understood aviation vocabulary, that's one of those single words that's rich with meaning, and it triggers in the cabin crew, the flight attendants, the beginning of their commands to the passengers to avoid injury during the landing, which is brace, brace, heads down, stay down. And I used the word impact that I chose in the spur of the moment, not something that we were trained at that time to do, to give them an image, a verbal picture of what to expect, that it was going to be, without thrust, a harder than usual landing, and that they should work very hard to avoid injury by bracing well during the impact.
We often hear that it is safer to fly right now than it is to cross the street. Is that still true?
It is, and certainly to fly than to drive. We're going through a brief period of tragic losses, especially with the shoot down, but it's still statistically safer to fly than it has been for many, many years, and it's getting safer all the time.
Okay, we have lots more to talk about, but we are going to take a break right now.